In 1718, a man named Edward Teach sailed into the port of Charleston, South Carolina, with a fleet of 4 ships and over 400 armed pirates. He blockaded the entire harbor. Nothing got in, nothing got out. For nearly a week, one of the wealthiest colonial cities in the Americas was held hostage by a man the world would remember as Blackbeard. And Charleston wasn't some backwater fishing village. It was a major hub of British trade, guarded by the Royal Navy, protected by colonial law. None of that mattered. Blackbeard parked his ships at the mouth of the harbor and dared anyone to do something about it. His demand? Medicine. That's it. A chest of medical supplies for his crew. And the governor of South Carolina, one of the most powerful men in the colonies, handed it over without a fight. That single moment tells you everything you need to know about the Golden Age of Piracy. For roughly 30 years, from the 1690s to the 1720s, a loose network of outlaws, deserters, former slaves, and runaway sailors built an empire on the open ocean that rivaled the navies of the most powerful nations on Earth. They didn't just rob ships, they shut down trade routes, they toppled colonial governors, they created their own laws, their own democracies, their own codes of justice, decades before the American Revolution. This is the full story of how pirates took over the world and how the world fought back. Before we get into it, only a small percentage of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. So if you end up enjoying this one, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. To understand piracy, you need to understand the map. Picture the Atlantic Ocean in the late 1600s. On the east side, you've got Europe, Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, Portugal. All of them fighting over the same thing, control of the New World. On the west side, you've got the Caribbean, hundreds of islands scattered across warm, shallow waters. Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Barbados, Trinidad. Below them, the coast of South America stretching down through Venezuela and Brazil. Above them, the American colonies running from Georgia up through Virginia, the Carolinas, New York, and Massachusetts. Now draw a line. Ships loaded with gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, and enslaved people sailed from the Caribbean and the Americas back to Europe. That line crossed thousands of miles of open water with almost no protection. And sitting right in the middle of that line? Nassau, in the Bahamas. A natural deep-water harbor on the island of New Providence, surrounded by shallow sandbars that kept large warships out, but let smaller, faster vessels slip through easily. Nassau became the unofficial capital of piracy. But the story of how it got there starts much further back. The roots of the Golden Age trace back to a group of men who weren't pirates at all. They were hunters. In the early 1600s, the island of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic was crawling with wild cattle and pigs. French settlers on the western half of the island made their living hunting these animals and smoking the meat on wooden frames called boucans. The Spanish called these men buccaneers. Spain controlled Hispaniola, at least on paper, and they did not want French squatters on their island. So they did what empires do. They sent soldiers to drive the buccaneers off the land, slaughtered the wild herds to starve them out, and burned their camps. It worked. The buccaneers were homeless. But they weren't beaten. Pushed off the land, they took to the sea. And they had a very specific grudge against Spain. These early buccaneers settled on the island of Tortuga, just off the northern coast of Hispaniola. Tortuga became the first real pirate haven in the Caribbean. A rocky, defensible island with a good harbor and absolutely zero interest in following anyone's laws. From Tortuga, the buccaneers launched raids on Spanish shipping. At first, these were small operations, a single sloop with 20 or 30 men attacking merchant vessels. But word spread. Deserters from European navies, runaway indentured servants, escaped slaves, and adventurers looking for fortune all made their way to Tortuga. And here's where it gets interesting. The governments of England and France didn't try to stop them. They encouraged them. The European powers had a problem. Maintaining large navies was staggeringly expensive. Warships cost fortunes to build, crew, and supply. And in the Caribbean, where the distances were vast and the enemies were spread across hundreds of islands, traditional naval power wasn't enough. So the English, French, and Dutch came up with an elegant solution. They outsourced their warfare to pirates. A privateer was a pirate with a permission slip. The government issued a document called a letter of marque that essentially said, "Go attack our enemy's ships, keep most of what you steal, and we'll pretend you're a legitimate military operation." It was a spectacular deal for everyone involved. The government got a free navy. The privateers got legal cover for robbery. And the enemy, usually Spain, got pillaged. The most famous privateer of this era was Henry Morgan. A Welshman who sailed under English letters of marque, Morgan didn't just raid ships, he raided entire cities. In 1668, Morgan led a fleet of privateers against the Spanish city of Portobelo in modern-day Panama. Portobelo was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Americas. It was the collection point for all the gold and silver coming out of South American mines before it was shipped back to Spain. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Morgan took it in 3 days. His men overwhelmed the garrison, looted the city, and walked away with the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in modern currency. 3 years later, Morgan did something even more audacious. He marched an army of 1,200 men across the Isthmus of Panama through dense jungle with almost no food or supplies and attacked Panama City itself. The wealthiest city in the Americas. He burned it to the ground. Spain was furious. England was delighted. Morgan was eventually knighted by King Charles II and made the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Think about that. A man who burned cities, killed soldiers, and stole millions was rewarded with a government position. That's how intertwined piracy and statecraft were during this period. But the privateer system had a fatal flaw. Sooner or later, the wars ended. And when peace came, the letters of marque expired. Thousands of trained, armed, experienced sailors suddenly had no legal way to do the only thing they knew how to do. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 ended the 9 Years' War between France and the Grand Alliance. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ended the War of the Spanish Succession. Both treaties meant peace in Europe, and peace in Europe meant unemployment in the Caribbean. Privateers who had spent years or decades raiding under government authority were told to go home, find honest work, and forget about the fortunes they'd been promised. Many of them had never received their full pay. Some had been cheated outright by the same governments that had licensed them. At the same time, the Royal Navy was downsizing. Tens of thousands of sailors were discharged with little or no compensation. These were men who had spent their lives on ships. They had no land, no trade, no family connections to fall back on. And the merchant navy, the only other option for experienced sailors, treated its crews horrifically. Merchant sailors in this period faced conditions that were barely distinguishable from slavery. Pay was terrible and often withheld. Food was rotten. Captains had absolute authority and used flogging, starvation, and confinement as routine punishment. A merchant sailor who complained could be beaten. One who refused an order could be killed. So when these men looked at their options, honest poverty under a tyrant captain or illegal wealth under their own rules, the choice wasn't hard. Between 1714 and 1718, piracy in the Caribbean and Atlantic exploded. and the epicenter was Nassau. Nassau in the early 1700s was a failed colony. The British had claimed the Bahamas, but barely invested in them. The governor had fled. The fort was crumbling. The few hundred legitimate settlers were essentially on their own. Pirates filled the vacuum. By 1716, Nassau was home to somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pirates. They elected their own leaders. They shared plunder according to agreed-upon rules. They settled disputes through votes and councils. Historians have called it the Republic of Pirates. And while that term is somewhat romantic, it captures something real. The pirates of Nassau created a functioning society built on principles that were, in many ways, more democratic than anything in the European colonies. Every pirate ship operated under a set of written rules called articles. Before a crew went on account, meaning before they officially became pirates, every man signed the articles. These documents covered everything: how plunder would be divided. The captain typically received 1.5 to 2 shares. The quartermaster, who represented the crew's interests, received 1.25. Every ordinary crew member received 1 full share. Compare that to a merchant vessel, where the captain and owners took the vast majority and the crew got scraps. How decisions would be made. On a pirate ship, the crew voted on major decisions: where to sail, whether to attack a particular ship, whether to accept new members. The captain had absolute authority only during battle. At all other times, the quartermaster held equal or greater power, and the crew could vote to remove the captain at any time. Compensation for injury. The articles typically included a schedule of payments for men who were wounded in action. Lost a right arm? You received 600 pieces of 8. Lost a left leg? 500 pieces of 8. Lost an eye? 100 pieces of 8. This was, in effect, a disability insurance policy. No European Navy or merchant fleet offered anything comparable. Rules of conduct: no fighting on board, no gambling for money, no women brought aboard without crew consent. Lights out by 8 o'clock, weapons to be kept clean and ready at all times. These weren't suggestions, they were binding agreements. A pirate who violated the articles faced punishment decided by the crew, from flogging to marooning to death. The system worked because every man had a stake in it, and every man had agreed to the terms. This is what made piracy so attractive. It wasn't just about money, though the money was extraordinary. It was about dignity. On a pirate ship, a man had rights. He had a voice, he had a share. On a merchant ship or a Royal Navy vessel, he had nothing. The Golden Age produced dozens of famous pirates, but 3 names dominate the story. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, was the most terrifying figure of the era, not because he was the most violent. He actually killed relatively few people compared to other pirates, but because he understood something fundamental about piracy: reputation was worth more than gunpowder. Blackbeard cultivated his image with deliberate precision. He was a massive man with a thick black beard that he braided into tails and tied with ribbons. Before battle, he tucked slow-burning fuses under his hat so that his head was wreathed in smoke. He carried 6 pistols strapped across his chest and multiple swords and knives. The effect was calculated. When a merchant captain saw a Blackbeard ship approaching, flying the black flag, with this demon-looking figure standing at the bow, surrounded by smoke, most of them surrendered immediately. That was the entire point. A fight meant damage to the ship, injuries to the crew, and risk of losing everything. A surrender meant everyone walked away alive, and Blackbeard got what he wanted without firing a shot. At his peak, Blackbeard commanded a fleet of 4 ships, with the Queen Anne's Revenge as his flagship. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a former French slave ship that Blackbeard had captured and modified. He added 40 cannons to her, making her one of the most heavily armed vessels in the Western Atlantic. With this fleet, Blackbeard controlled the shipping lanes between the Caribbean and the American colonies. The blockade of Charleston was his most audacious move, but it was only one of dozens of operations that made him the most feared man on the Atlantic. Then there was Calico Jack Rackham. Jack wasn't the most successful pirate. His raids were relatively small-time compared to Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts. But his crew included two of the most remarkable figures in pirate history, Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Anne Bonny was the daughter of a wealthy Irish lawyer who had settled in Charleston, South Carolina. She married a small-time pirate named James Bonny, who turned out to be a coward and an informant. Anne left him for Calico Jack and joined his crew as a full-fledged pirate. Mary Red had spent much of her life disguised as a man. She had served in the British military, fought in the War of the Spanish Succession, and eventually ended up on a merchant ship that was captured by Calico Jack's crew. Rather than be taken prisoner, she joined them. Both women fought alongside the men, and, by every surviving account, were among the fiercest fighters on the ship. When Calico Jack's sloop was finally captured by pirate hunter Jonathan Barnett in October 1720, most of the male crew was too drunk to fight. Bonny and Red were the last two standing, holding off the boarding party while the men hid below deck. The story goes that Anne Bonny's last words to Calico Jack before his execution were devastating. She told him that if he had fought like a man, he wouldn't have to die like a dog. If Blackbeard was the most famous pirate, Bartholomew Roberts was the most successful. And it's not even close. Roberts, known as Black Bart, captured over 400 ships during his career. 400. No pirate before or since has come close to that number. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. He operated across an enormous range, from the Caribbean to the coast of Brazil to the shores of West Africa. What made Roberts exceptional wasn't brute force. It was organization. He ran his pirate fleet like a professional military operation. His articles were the most detailed of any pirate captain. His ships were well-maintained, well-armed, and well-crewed. He insisted on discipline, banned gambling and excessive drinking during operations, and paid his men on a strict schedule. Roberts was also flamboyant. He dressed in crimson silk, wore a diamond-studded cross around his neck, and carried 2 pairs of pistols on a silk sling. He flew a custom flag showing himself standing on 2 skulls, one labeled ABH for a Barbadian's head and the other AMH for a Martinican's head, a reference to 2 colonial governors who had offended him. But Roberts was also ruthless when he needed to be. When the governor of Martinique sent warships after him, Roberts captured one, hung the governor's men from the yardarm, and sent the ship back as a warning. When slave traders resisted, Roberts burned their ships with the enslaved people still chained below deck. He wasn't a romantic figure. He was a professional predator operating in a violent world. Roberts's career lasted from 1719 to 1722. In just 3 years, he caused more economic damage to European trade than any other single pirate in history. His operations disrupted the Atlantic slave trade, paralyzed sugar and tobacco shipments, and forced insurance rates for Caribbean shipping to skyrocket. The colonial powers couldn't ignore him. Roberts had become an existential threat to the entire Atlantic economy. Hollywood gave us the idea of a single pirate code that all pirates followed. That's not accurate, but it's not entirely wrong either. Every pirate ship had its own articles, and while they varied in specifics, they shared common principles. Historian Marcus Rediker identified several universal elements across dozens of surviving articles. Democratic governance, captains were elected and could be removed. Major decisions required a vote of the full crew. Fair distribution of plunder. The gap between the highest paid pirate and the lowest was never more than 2 to 1. On a merchant ship, the gap between captain and common sailor was often 50 to 1 or more. collective welfare, injury compensation, shared food and drink, and communal responsibility for the ship's upkeep. Racial inclusion, at least compared to legitimate society. Black pirates sailed alongside white pirates on many ships. Some rose to positions of authority. Blackbeard's crew included a significant number of formerly enslaved Africans. Black Caesar, a legendary figure whose full history is debated, operated as a pirate in the Florida Keys and later served as one of Blackbeard's most trusted lieutenants. This doesn't mean pirate society was some kind of utopia. Violence was constant. Captives were sometimes tortured. Not every crew followed their own rules. And the men who became pirates were products of an extraordinarily brutal era. But the pirate articles represented something genuinely radical, a written social contract agreed upon by all participants in which every person had defined rights and a voice in governance. Scholars have pointed out that these articles predated the United States Constitution by roughly 70 years, and they were being practiced by men who the ruling class considered the worst criminals alive. For years, the European powers struggled to contain piracy. The reasons were practical, political, and geographic. Practically, the Caribbean was enormous, and the Royal Navy was stretched thin. Warships couldn't be everywhere at once. Pirates operated in small, fast sloops that could outrun anything larger and navigate shallow waters that warships couldn't enter. Chasing pirates across the open ocean was like trying to swat flies with a sledgehammer. Politically, the situation was tangled. Colonial governors often profited from piracy. Pirates spent their stolen gold in colonial ports, boosting local economies. Merchants bought stolen goods at steep discounts. Tavern keepers, shipwrights, prostitutes, and suppliers all depended on pirate money. Arresting pirates meant arresting your own economy. Some governors went further. Benjamin Hornigold, one of Nassau's founding pirates, had connections to colonial officials who looked the other way in exchange for a cut. Charles Eden, the governor of North Carolina, was widely believed to be in Blackbeard's pocket. Eden officiated the proceedings when Blackbeard accepted a royal pardon, then allegedly helped him fence stolen goods afterward. Geographically, the pirates had the advantage. Nassau's harbor was perfect for defense. The shallow sandbars around New Providence meant that large warships couldn't approach. Pirates could anchor safely, careen their ships, repair their hulls, and resupply without fear of a naval assault. And the pirates had numbers. At the height of the Golden Age, an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 active pirates operated in the Caribbean and Atlantic. That might not sound like a lot, but these were experienced combat sailors operating in coordinated groups across the busiest trade routes in the world. The economic damage was staggering. Between 1716 and 1726, pirates captured or destroyed an estimated 2,400 ships. Insurance rates for Caribbean routes tripled. Some merchants stopped shipping entirely. The Atlantic economy, the engine that powered European colonial expansion, was grinding to a halt. Something had to be done. The British government decided to take Nassau back, and they sent exactly the right man to do it. Woodes Rogers was a former privateer himself. He had circumnavigated the globe, rescued the real-life castaway who inspired Robinson Crusoe, and earned a fortune raiding Spanish ships in the Pacific. He understood pirates because he had essentially been one. In 1718, Rogers arrived in Nassau with a small fleet, a royal pardon for any pirate who surrendered, and a clear mandate: clean up the Bahamas or burn it down. The strategy was brilliant. Rogers offered amnesty. Any pirate who gave up the life would be pardoned for all previous crimes. No prosecution, no punishment, a clean slate. But anyone who refused the pardon would be hunted and hanged. It worked partially. Hundreds of pirates accepted the pardon. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founders of the Nassau Pirate Republic, not only surrendered, but switched sides entirely and became a pirate hunter, tracking down his former colleagues for the British government. But not everyone took the deal. Charles Vane, one of the most defiant pirates of the era, actually fired on Rogers' fleet as it entered Nassau Harbor, then escaped into the open sea rather than submit. Rogers' arrival marked the beginning of the end for Nassau as a pirate haven. He rebuilt the fort, established a garrison, appointed civil officials, and started hanging pirates who were captured. Within a year, Nassau had transformed from a pirate republic into a functional British colony. But Rogers didn't end piracy. He just pushed it somewhere else. The pirates who refused the pardon scattered across the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the coast of Africa. And some of the biggest names in pirate history, Blackbeard, Roberts Vane, were still at large. The end of the Golden Age came not in a single battle, but through a sustained campaign of capture and execution. Blackbeard died first, on November 22, 1718, just months after the blockade of Charleston. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy tracked Blackbeard to Ocracoke Inlet off the coast of North Carolina. The battle was ferocious. Blackbeard fought hand-to-hand on the deck of Maynard's ship. According to the accounts, he took 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts before he finally went down. Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his ship as a warning. He sailed back to Virginia with the head dangling over the water. Calico Jack was captured in 1720 and hanged in Jamaica. His body was placed in a gibbet, an iron cage, and displayed at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor as a warning to other pirates. Anne Bonny and Mary Red escaped execution because both claimed to be pregnant, which under English law granted a temporary reprieve. Red died in prison, likely from fever. Bonny's fate is unknown. She simply disappeared from the historical record. Charles Vane was captured in 1721 after being shipwrecked and recognized by a former acquaintance. He was brought to Jamaica in chains and hanged in March 1721. His body was also displayed in a gibbet. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of them all, died on February 10, 1722, during a battle with HMS Swallow off the coast of Cape Lopez in modern-day Gabon. A blast of grape shot hit him in the throat. His crew, honoring his wishes, threw his body overboard before the British could capture it. Roberts' death is considered by most historians to be the end of the Golden Age of piracy. With his fleet destroyed and his crew captured, the last major pirate force in the Atlantic was gone. The British hanged 52 of Roberts' crew at Cape Coast Castle in West Africa. It was the largest mass execution of pirates in history. The pirate trials of this era were as much about politics as justice. The British government understood that piracy was an ideological threat, not just an economic one. Pirates represented an alternative, a world where men governed themselves, shared wealth relatively equally, and lived outside the control of kings and merchants. In an era when European monarchies claimed divine authority and colonial economies ran on enslaved labor, that alternative was dangerous. The trial transcripts reveal something fascinating. Pirates who were captured and brought before the courts often made arguments that sounded remarkably modern. They talked about the cruelty of merchant captains. They talked about stolen wages. They talked about the right to govern themselves. Samuel Bellamy, known as Black Sam, was captured with a crew that included a significant number of formerly enslaved Africans. During his earlier career, Bellamy had given a famous speech to a merchant captain he'd robbed. He called the captain a sniveling puppy and said that the difference between them was that Bellamy robbed under the protection of his own courage, while the captain robbed under the protection of law. The courts weren't interested in these arguments. Pirates were tried quickly, convicted quickly, and hanged quickly. Their bodies were tarred and displayed in metal cages at harbor entrances across the Caribbean and Atlantic. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge the system. The Golden Age of piracy lasted roughly 30 years. In the grand sweep of history, that's barely a footnote, but the impact was enormous. Economically, piracy reshaped the Atlantic world. Insurance markets were created to manage the risk of pirate attacks. Naval strategy was revolutionized by the need to protect merchant shipping. The fortification of colonial ports, the establishment of permanent naval bases in the Caribbean, and the development of convoy systems all trace back to the pirate threat. Politically, piracy forced the European empires to invest in their colonial infrastructure. Before the Golden Age, many Caribbean colonies were neglected afterthoughts. After it, they became strategic priorities with permanent garrisons, professional governors, and functioning legal systems. Culturally, the pirates entered the popular imagination almost immediately. Daniel Defoe published A General History of the Pirates in 1724, just 2 years after Roberts's death. That book, though filled with exaggerations and possible fabrications, created the template for how we think about pirates today. The buried treasure, the black flag, the romantic outlaw, the pirate code. Much of what we believe about pirates comes from that single book, and while the reality was grittier, more violent, and more complex than the myth, the core truth remains. For a brief window in history, a group of men and women who were at the absolute bottom of the social order built their own society on the open ocean, challenged the most powerful empires in the world, and nearly won. They didn't win, of course. Empire always had more ships, more guns, more money, and more time. The Golden Age ended the way every challenge to concentrated power ends, with executions, display cages, and a slow return to the status quo. But the ideas survived. The pirate articles, with their democratic governance and equitable pay, were a genuine experiment in self-rule at a time when such ideas were considered treason. The fact that they emerged among the most marginalized people in the Atlantic world makes them even more remarkable. There's a reason we still talk about pirates 300 years later. It's not the treasure, it's not the flags. It's the idea that a group of outcasts looked at the world they'd been handed and said, "No, we'll make our own." The Golden Age of Piracy ended in the 1720s, but the questions it raised about power, freedom, and who gets to make the rules, those haven't gone away. And if you want to see how another group of outlaws built an empire that challenged the most powerful navy in the world, that video is on screen right now. Subscribe for more stories like this.